All right, so if you got a Bible, flip on over to Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6 is where we're going to be. It's where we've been the last 5 or 6 weeks, with the exception of last week where we took a little detour into Matthew. But we're back to finish off the Sermon on the Plain. Can we give it up for the Sermon on the Plain? Okay, here's the deal. I'm going to preach shorter if you guys talk with me, all right? I want to know that there's some people out there, I can't see you, so I need to hear you. You feel me? Thank you. All right, we're good. I was telling the team when I ask a question that includes, I'm usually looking for a response. So let me ask you this. What's your name? Okay, that was like half of you got what I was going to. What's your name? There's at least 6 Levi's in the crowd. If you know Levi, he's a good man. Why are we doing those interviews? We're doing those interviews because we want people to get to know some of the different faces at Lift Church. So we're going to be doing some of our leaders like Elijah, but also some people that fly under the radar that maybe you've never seen or you've never met. So we're just going to drop those on you at random. Also, to just clear up one little thing, church, this is not the last Sunday of the month. It's the second Sunday of the month. It's okay. We love you, Josh. Church is still happening the rest of the month. Question, who's going to the leadership retreat next weekend? Yeah, I feel it. All right, it's good. So it's going to be a great weekend. Really looking forward to it. Stay tuned. There'll be an email dropping in your inbox either tomorrow or Tuesday with all of the logistical details. But I'm telling you, it is going to be a fantastic weekend. And we're going to be spending some time in the Word, in community. But ultimately, we're going to spend time praying, saying, Jesus, what do you want to teach us as a church? Which I am excited about. But we're here to get into the Word and in Luke chapter 6 tonight. So why don't we just take a moment and pray to prepare our hearts for what Jesus wants to say tonight. Jesus, we humble ourselves before you. We humble ourselves and we say, Jesus, you speak in this place. You say what you want to say. Jesus, I pray that people would not hear my words, but they would hear the crazy, radical, life-giving truths that you spoke yourself, Jesus. I pray that people would walk out going, wow, I want to know this, Jesus. Amen. All right, Luke chapter 6. So we've been in this series called Lord, Lord. And the premise of the series is we've been asking the question, very simple question, what if Jesus meant what he said? Look to your neighbor and say, what if? What if? It's been an intense series. Every week I've given a preface that it's going to continue to be intense. Well, guess what? It's going to stay at the intense meter at extreme tonight. Extreme is a great word, isn't it? I must warn you, you need to listen to the whole sermon. If you listen to these sermons only in piecemeal, you're going to get very, very confused. You need to listen all the way through. And so what I want to encourage you to do is sit up, look to your neighbor, say, sit up. If they're asleep, give them an elbow. We're going to be studying the Word tonight. And so in Luke chapter 6, Jesus preaches this thing called the Sermon on the Plain, which is very similar to the Sermon on the Mount. And he is announcing this radical, upside-down kingdom. And he's describing what the kingdom that he's inaugurating is designed to look like. He's giving it some parameters and some descriptors so that when he leaves, we have a clear picture of what Jesus' kingdom is all about. The challenge is that Jesus' announcement of Jesus' kingdom is extremely challenging because it's designed to turn all of our presuppositions, all of our thinking upside down. We've talked so far about loving your enemies and the idea that the enemy is anyone that we fail to see God's image in. It's a challenging word. We talked about what it means to be blessed, to be poor. We talked about fruitfulness and the treasures of our heart. We've talked last week about what it means to steward what God has given us. But tonight I want to talk about self-perception. Self-perception. We have left, it's in the middle of the sermon, but I think it's actually probably the hardest set of verses to faithfully preach. I was wrestling with this throughout the last couple of weeks, and I said, I'm not going to give this to Brian or John. That would be mean. Because these are challenging. Not that they can't handle anything challenging. I don't want to throw those guys under the bus. But I didn't want to be cruel. These are intense words, but they're also very easy words to misunderstand. So why don't we read them? Luke 6, starting in verse 37. Do not, everybody say judge. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn. Everybody say condemn. And you will not be condemned. Forgive. Can I get a forgive? And you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For the measure you use, it will be measured to you. He also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your eye, and then you will clearly see to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Well, let's just get straight into it tonight. What is Jesus talking about? What's this section in the sermon getting at? What's Jesus trying to uproot and challenge? And the answer is this: he's talking about self-righteousness. What? What's self-righteousness? Everybody say self-righteous. Everybody say it's not righteous. I'm going to wrap up here in a moment. Self-righteousness, this idea that the way in which we perceive ourselves does not align with the reality of who we are. Let me say it another way. Self-righteousness is when we think we are perfect, but we are in fact horribly, horrifically imperfect. It's when there is a massive ocean between the way we perceive ourselves and the reality of who we are. It says this: do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Do not judge. Come on, who's read that verse and gone, no, I do pretty good at that. I'm not a very judgmental person. I gotta give a shout out to my Simple Church this week. I asked them, how critical do you guys think you are? And they all rated themselves like 5 out of 5 critical. I'm not going to tell you who was there. But they're beautiful people. You see, there's a tendency with this text to go, I'm doing okay with it. In the same way, there's a tendency to go, I love my enemies. Do you? Do you love your enemies? You see, when we start to unpack it and we hit pause, maybe we start to realize that, hold on, Jesus is trying to challenge us. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Some of us, what we do with this text is we go, well, he wasn't talking about that person. He wasn't talking about that category of sin. He wasn't talking about that style of living. So it's my responsibility, if I'm loving them, to judge them. But remember the premise of this series, the premise of the sermon, that Jesus is designing it to challenge your thinking. So if your thinking goes, well, let me explain away what Jesus did, let me ignore what Jesus did, let me tell you what Jesus is saying doesn't apply, then you have missed the point of the sermon. See, what we want to do is we want to go, well, if I don't correct them, or if I don't tell them how it is, if I don't manage them, if I don't let them know where they're... And yet Jesus says, do not judge. Do not judge. But come on, who in this place is going, yeah, but he didn't mean all judgment. He didn't mean all kinds of... Is there a yeah, but in your mind? See, what we love to do is we love to explain why Jesus' words don't apply in our particular context, and yet we fail to apply Jesus' words to the context of our hearts. Why? Why? See, most of us, if we're honest in this place, think that we're doing just fine in this thing called life, right? We think we're doing just right. I'm a good person. I read my Bible. I'm not mean to people most of the time. If I squint, there was that one time, but we're not going to talk about that. I'm a good person. I'm doing just fine. In fact, more than okay. I'm actually, some of us strut around. I'm the boss. My spiritual life is intact. I follow Jesus. I read my Bible, not every day, but twice a day, morning and evening, and I pray at dinner. And we go through life and we go, I've got it figured out. I can judge because, well, it's okay. I've figured it out. I'm doing just fine. We assume that Jesus isn't speaking to us in these moments. We assume that these words don't apply. And so what we tend to do as Christians, we tend to assume a position of judgmental superiority. We tend to assume that our perspective somehow gives us license to be critical of those around us, to lay down the hammer on our perspective. It was interesting. Have you guys ever been to when you're at a coffee shop and you're eavesdropping? You're all judging me right now, but you know it's true. Hey, thank you. I got one person who's honest with me. Right, you go to the coffee shop and you're eavesdropping, and this was yesterday. I was trying not to eavesdrop, and I was at a coffee shop with Laura, and there were these two girls, and they were going at it. And if they're here tonight, I don't know, maybe they are. I love you. It was great, wonderful conversation. But it's amazing how when we start to talk with our friends, man, we just start venting. We just got to get it off our plate. I just got to get it off my chest. I talked about this a couple weeks ago. I just got to get it off my chest. I just got to tell them how it is. Isn't it interesting how much critiquing we have in our conversations? Can we go for coffee is like code for can we sit and gossip? Come on, can I get an amen? Can we sit and have a little powwow around why we're superior? Around why Jesus' words do not judge, don't apply in that moment. Well, they need to be corrected. I have a question. Has that ever in your life produced peace? When you measure it by its fruits, does it stand the test? And I submit to you, if you're honest, it probably doesn't. Do not judge. Man, this is a great opening line to the sermon tonight. Do not judge. Church, I've heard a lot of people explain to me why they can cast that critique or cast that judgment against their brother or their sister. About why they can cast that critique against that leader. About why their perspective is somehow privileged that allows them to cast that critique. And yet I don't so often see people who are willing to humbly say, what do I need to learn? You see, we want to assume the position of judge, but we never want to assume the position of the judged. We want the position of superiority without the consequences that it comes. And what Jesus says is, do not judge, for you will be judged. Do not assume the position of superiority unless you're consistent with the standard that you apply. And here's the challenge, church. I know what you're thinking. I'm consistent. We're going to spend the next 20 minutes examining if that's true. There's two do nots in this text. There's do not judge, and then there's do not condemn. Everybody say condemn. And what we assume is that judgment and condemnation are inherently bad things. Well, Jesus says not to do them, so therefore they must be bad. I want to examine what Jesus is getting at here. What is Jesus trying to say? Is he trying to say, let me ask this question, is he trying to say that you should never apply a critical mind to something? Is he trying to say and advocate for moral anarchy? Is he trying to say that we're the preservations of moral, not anarchy? I don't know what, moral stability. What is Jesus getting at here? And what Jesus is getting at fundamentally is the question, as I said earlier, of self-righteousness. How do we perceive ourselves? And what Jesus is inviting us to do here is to stop and take a moment to actually examine the contents and the condition of our hearts. To stop, to take that pause and say, actually, am I consistent? Are there elements of my life, is there elements of the condition of my heart that are ugly, that are not whole? Am I in a position where I can cast that critique, and yet if someone was to come to me with a critique, I would humbly respond to it? A number of months ago, I was just doing my thing, and one day, and somebody came up to me and unloaded a critique on my character. And I remember I sat there and I didn't know what to do with it. They unloaded this critique, and then over the last number of months, I've had to ask the question, number one, can I receive the critique without in turn becoming judgmental? And number two, is there validity in the critique? And it was extremely difficult to receive a critique and yet not respond to it. You see, we want to assume the position of judge, but sometimes I wonder if the condition of our heart is measured by what happens when people judge us. When people lay their critique on you, how do you respond? What does your heart say? Are you immediately to the defensive? Just going to leave that there for you to think on. But you see, here's why Jesus says not to judge. It's not because he's advocating for moral anarchy. It's not because he's asking us to throw out critical reasoning. It's actually for a very simple reason. The reason is that he wants us to stop and examine the condition of our hearts. To actually pause and say, Jesus, are you trying to challenge me? Are you trying to speak to me? What if every time we had a critical thought come into our minds, we said, wait a second, Holy Spirit, what do you want to say to me? Not what do you want me to say to this person, but what do you want to say to me? I'm going to give you an example from years ago when I was in high school. Was anybody in a crappy band in high school? No one, got like a couple people over there brave enough to believe it. Thank you, Luke. My band was crappier than your band, I guarantee it. I was in a really terrible band in high school. Our lead singer was tone deaf. I don't know if you heard me, my lead singer was tone deaf. That's not a good thing. That is not a good thing. And he... Oh, Lord. I wasn't the lead singer. I'm not. This isn't an autobiography. Although it could have been. Anyway, he was also a guitarist, and he was so tone deaf he never knew when his guitar was out of tune. It was really about as terrible as you can imagine. And I remember we went up to him and said, hey man, you should really consider taking singing lessons. And you should really consider taking guitar lessons. And I'll never forget, he came up to me and he said to me, I took guitar lessons once last year. I was basically teaching the teacher. And I was like, bro, you're tone deaf. You know 3 chords. How is it possible that you were teaching the teacher? And he was like, I'm amazing. This guy was convinced, this is a quote, that he was the next Ozzy Osbourne. Of all the people you're going to aim at in life, why Ozzy? And you know what the funny thing is, church? We're exactly like that. My buddy is a great guy, but man, he couldn't sing. Not only could he not sing, he was convinced that everybody around him also couldn't sing and that he needed to take their job. And so he became very critical of all the musicians around him and refused to listen. The reality is that we are actually, if we hit the pause button, what Jesus is saying is that we are all spiritually tone deaf. And what we tend to assume is that in our deafness we can speak clearly, that we can sing the song of judgment. But the problem when you're tone deaf is that you don't know that you're off key. And so we cast judgment against people. We cast judgment against our brothers and our sisters. We secretly gossip and share their critiques, and yet we're not even aware that we're doing it. And so when somebody calls us out on it, we go, there's nothing here, man. Why you got to get all up on my grill? Don't judge me. And what Jesus says, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. He's not trying to maintain the status quo. What he's saying here is that we are all under a state where we are worthy of judgment. If we judge, we will be judged. If we condemn, we will be condemned. We are, in our natural state, not a people that are worthy. In fact, we are worthy of judgment. The reason we are not to judge is because Jesus says you have work to do in you. He's not trying to maintain the status quo. He's trying to point all of us to a higher standard. And this is why, actually, right before the standard was laid out in Jesus. Check it out, Luke 6, verse 35. When you love your enemies, you will truly be acting as children of the Most High, for He is kind to those who are unthankful and wicked. You must be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. The problem we have, church, is that we compare ourselves to ourselves and we go, I'm doing a pretty good job. But what Jesus does here is He points to the standard of the compassionate and gracious and worthy and majestic and infinite Creator God. And He says the standard to which we are called is here. And yet we want to do is we want to say, well, actually the standard's here and check it out, I'm hitting it. And what Jesus says is no. Actually the standard is this compassionate, gracious God who loves the ungrateful. This is a hard word because what I'm saying is that we need to have a revelation of how inadequate our goodness is in proportion to the infinite greatness of our God. We need to have a revelation of how small our grace is in comparison to the grace of our God. And until we are willing to actually submit ourselves to the standard of who God is, we have no business being a people of critiquing. This is hard. The reason Jesus says do not judge isn't because there is no judgment to be made. He says do not judge and you will not be judged. Alternatively, do not judge, for you should be judged. The challenge is that we are all worthy, not to be the judge, but to be the condemned. Because we walk around thinking that we've hit the standard, but we fall so short. Every single one of us is guilty. If you read the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, the entire narrative is here is, if you even so much as speak poorly of your brother, calling him insults, you are guilty of what? Of murder. Guess what? We're all murderers in the house. If you even lust after you're committing adultery. Guess what? We're all adulterers in the house tonight. Until we learn to allow Jesus' words to get inside us and convict us that we have work to do, that He is not done transforming us, the words out of our mouth better be a people that point to Jesus, not point to our standard of excellence. You see, self-righteousness has a cost associated with it. It fundamentally is a distortion of who we are. We tend to think we're perfect. We tend to think we're like God. We tend to think we're hitting home runs. And yet Jesus is saying, actually, the standard I'm calling you to is so much greater than you could ever imagine. Don't worry, there's some good news coming. But man, we got to let this get inside us. You see, the job of the Scriptures is to help us see ourselves how we really are. To help us recognize that actually before we speak, we need to say, Jesus, what's going on in my heart? This is an invitation to hit the pause button before we offer the critique. There's an interesting cost associated with self-righteousness beyond just a distortion of who we are. He tells this parable in verse 39. Can the blind, everybody say blind, lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like the teacher. Can the blind lead the blind? I was originally going to do something ridiculous and try to get a blind person to try and tell another blind person how to sink a football in a garbage can. But that's not going to happen because I didn't want to hurt anyone and have them like blindly wander off the stage. But you see, there's a cost. When we think and when we adopt this position of I can judge and I can condemn and I can say whatever I want to say and I'm in the position of authority, it effectively means that we become like a blind person trying to lead another blind person. When we assume we've got it right, I want to tell you a story. When I was just starting my job as an engineer, a number of years ago, quite a few years ago now. Eesh. Anyway, I remember I sat down for lunch with an old friend of mine. Very gracious. He was a good friend. And I ranted, man. I'd been at this job for maybe a year and a half. And I sat down and for the better part of 2 hours told him about how the bosses that I had, man, they were incompetent. I was convinced they had no idea what they were doing. That they were going to lead our company into ruin. And that I was the man to fix it. And for 3 hours I ranted about this and my friend faithfully listened. I kind of wished he had taken a bat and hit me upside the head and be like, dude, listen up. See, the problem is that in my self-righteousness, in assuming that my leaders didn't know what they were doing, I was blind to see that they maybe knew something I didn't. You see, when we allow ourselves to adopt this posture of self-righteousness, we become a people that believe that our way is the better way and that we see something that our teachers and our leaders don't. And yet what Jesus is saying here is actually, can you adopt a posture of humility and believe for just a second that maybe those that are leading you and around you have something to teach you that you don't yet know. The challenge of being blind is that you don't know what you're not seeing. Let me say that again. The challenge of being blind is that you don't know what you're not seeing. The challenge of being blind spiritually and in our self-righteousness is that we don't know what we're not seeing. And we need leaders around us that can point that out. Fundamentally, when we're adopting this posture of saying, I know what's going on, I know what's best, I'm a great person, I'm a great Christian, I know how to lead, how to speak, how to do everything, it means that the people around us can't actually see us grow. If you're taking notes, so you can write this down, self-righteousness stunts spiritual growth. Self-righteousness stunts spiritual growth. It says there that the student is not above the teacher. Come on, how many of you have thought, I could preach better than Robin? I'm sure you could, but you're not. What do I mean by that? When we sit there and assume, well, I could do it better, you're missing what maybe God is saying to you right now. Being the teacher doesn't mean that we're the wisest. It means that we're the person that God has placed to communicate. You know, some people over the years have come to me and said, I'm not being spiritually fed. I go, okay, that's interesting. I'm not being grown, I'm not being discipled. I go, that's interesting. Well, have you ever had a conversation with Susie? Is there a Susie in the house? No Susies? All right. Have you ever had a conversation with Susie? No, I could never have a conversation with Susie. Why not? Wow, she's too young. Oh. Well, Susie's actually been in your shoes before. Yeah, no, I know, but she couldn't. Self-righteousness stunting spiritual growth. You see, what we do is we systematically exclude every person from being able to speak into our life and then say, the church isn't feeding me. The church isn't growing me. Has it occurred that maybe we are actually excluding the people that God has put in your life that maybe want to speak to you? See, this is the challenge, is that it feels when we're blind and we're not seeing, it seems like everything, that our perspective is 20/20, and yet what we need to do is say, Jesus, help me to see. Help me to see the people, the opportunities, the things that you're trying to teach me. You see, when we adopt self-righteousness, we become blind to the fact that we ourselves are a work in progress. I had a whole bunch of other stuff I wanted to cover out of this, but I want to jump to the radical kind of kingdom that Jesus is introducing. There's some stuff about plank eyes and some brokenness that we got to fix, but there's a good news here too. And I want to jump down to it. Let's actually jump up to it. Verse 37, part B. Forgive and you will be forgiven. And then Jesus says, give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. What's the alternative? If Jesus is saying, look, I don't want you to be a people of judgment and condemnation, what kind of people do I want you to be? Well, firstly, tonight, church, he's calling us to be a people of forgiveness. To be a people of forgiveness. And I think the challenge with this is that forgiveness is the antidote to self-righteousness. Self-righteousness says, I don't need to change. They need to fix themselves. Forgiveness says, I release the burden that's been held against me. And I trust that Jesus is going to do what he needs to do. Forgiveness is like the antithesis of self-righteousness. It's a willingness to actually release and say, you know what, I don't need to cast judgment. I don't need to condemn. I'm actually going to say, I forgive you. And this metaphor that Jesus gives, that this forgiveness we give, we must give it abundantly. The picture is filling a cup with grain. And we fill this cup with grain, we shake it down, we press it down, and we pour some more in. And we keep pouring this generosity, this radical kind of forgiveness in, and it overflows in a peace and a joy. The gospel itself is this idea that was referenced just before, that even though we're broken, even though we're worthy of judgment, even though we're a people that don't hit the standard, God in His grace has forgiven us. You see, what we want to establish is a kingdom of judgment. We want to establish a kingdom of condemnation. Well, judgment and condemnation isolate and separate. But what Jesus does is He establishes a kingdom of forgiveness, a kingdom of grace, a kingdom of generosity. A people that overflow with compassion. Ultimately, the way this panned out for Jesus is that He said, I'm going to forgive you and actually serve you to the point of giving my life for you. Instead of just condemning us, Jesus said, I'm going to step in and I'm going to forgive you, all of humanity. And I'm going to generously give my life to you, for you, that you might in turn have life. See, this is the nature of grace. The nature of grace is that while we want to condemn, God wants to invite us to life. That while we want to be a people that naturally condemn and ostracize, Jesus says, I'm a person that's going to forgive and I'm going to invite in. It doesn't mean that we can stay the same. It doesn't mean that nothing matters. What it means is that we have an invitation to relationship, and out of that relationship, we become a transformed people. The cross is good news in this place. That we can be forgiven despite all of these imperfections. That we can walk a new kind of generous life. So what we're going to do just as we close is we're going to take up communion tonight. I'm going to get the team to pass it around.